Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today because we get to talk about a really cool book titled Atlas of Finance, Mapping the Global Story of Money, published by Yale University Press in 2024, which is literally an atlas, right? We think of atlases as being maps, as being really visual. That's exactly what this book is. It's absolutely gorgeous. And it's telling us the story of finance today, finance historically, finance in London, finance in Rio, finance really wherever, all sorts of ways that one can talk about these topics. And as the book beautifully shows, actually, there's a lot of financial topics that are much easier to understand when provided in such a gorgeous visual form. So I'm very pleased to welcome the lead author on the book, Dr. Dariusz Wojcik, to the podcast to tell us all about the book. Dariusz, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me, Miranda.
Could you start us off, please, by introducing yourself a little bit, also maybe mention kind of the team that helped you on this project, and explain why you all decided to work on this book?
Thank you. I'm a professor of financial geography at National University of Singapore, where I live now. Until last year, I worked as a professor of economic geography at Oxford University, and I'm still associated with Oxford. I also co-founded and I chair a global network on financial geography, and I'm editor-in-chief of a journal called Finance and Space. I created the Atlas with a big team of co-authors, 10 actually co-authors. I even forget the number sometimes of co-authors, including other researchers, a designer, and a cartographer.
And why this book? Why did you all come together for this project?
I decided to create it, and I came up with the idea over a decade ago. Because of my background, I had studied finance, economics, and geography, and I always wanted to combine these topics. And also I wanted to do an Atlas of Finance because I realized it didn't exist. So this is the first ever Atlas of Finance, first ever book size collection of maps and visuals dedicated to finance. So there are atlases of everything and anything. You can find atlases of phantom places, places that don't exist, cursed places, all kinds of monsters and foodstuffs. But until now, there had been no atlas of finance. And I thought this was a shame and a major gap, not only on the market, but something missing that could help us understand finance better.
Well, I think it certainly does that, and it's going to be very interesting to talk about. But before we get into the details of some of the pieces of the book, I wonder if you can maybe speak a bit to kind of why you felt such a need. You know, why was it so sad that there wasn't a book like this? I mean, besides the fact that it's very nerdy and cool, who's the kind of audience you're hoping this gap is filled for? I mean, who do you want to read this? What are the main things you want them to take away?
I think there wasn't an Atlas of Finance because finance is considered arcane and very technical, even though it's something that we use every day and we depend on in our daily lives, and we think and worry about a lot on a daily basis. But I think that most people would think that Atlas, that finance is about equations and very complicated mathematics, and you have to understand these equations in order to read about finance. So what we wanted to do was to show that you can actually understand finance through visuals and through maps, through colorful presentations that nevertheless communicate complex topics like investment, like financial technology, like fintech, for example.
Yes, there's definitely a lot of topics in this book. And in fact, that was kind of one of the very first things I wondered about when reading through it. How did you decide which topics to cover? Which things would work really well as visualizations? Which stories needed to be included? What was that decision making process like?
So we set out with general goals for the atlas. One was diversity of topics. We wanted a broad range of things, but not an encyclopedia. Because this you can find online, you can find in books, encyclopedias or Wikipedias or Investopedias. Second, we wanted broad geographical coverage. We wanted to cover all continents. We wanted broad range of cartographic styles. We wanted maps of cities, countries, regions, global networks, even maps of space that talk about finance. So most importantly, we wanted to tell people something they didn't know before with these maps. In terms of the process, that helped us decide what to include or exclude, we used GitHub. It's a project management tool used by software developers. So you basically take each part of your book, each map, each visual through dozens of work stages. And one of them was actually called Bloody Thursday, because for 2 years, every Thursday, we would meet to decide what to include, what to exclude. So my co-authors would and myself, we would pitch ideas. Ideas would get rejected or sent for major or minor revisions. It was a bit like in the scientific peer review process to which we are all used on the team that produced the atlas. And for each visual, as criteria for inclusion or rejection, we were using four things. There are four big things that have to come together for any visual in any atlas or beyond an atlas to work in this order. You have to have a good topic. You have to get good data for this topic. You need to find the right angle or story on this topic using this data. And then finally, you have to give it an interesting form. So this is something that these four building blocks of visual storytelling, something I learned from my cartographer and designer duo, James Cheshire and Oliver Uberti, who worked with us on the Atlas and who created atlases before the Atlas of Finance.
These are very good building blocks to work with. Thank you for explaining that part of the process. I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about the sort of data crunching side of things, I suppose. Obviously, with such a big team, it's very clear kind of how much work went into this. What is it like to do that? You know, you go through the four building blocks, you decide this is the story, this is the angle, this is how we're going to represent it. Is it always clear kind of what kind of visualization will tell that story in the most effective way? Do you have to play around with different options? Was there one that was kind of unexpectedly complicated or hard to make?
You are absolutely right, Miranda. This is a very complicated process and a very laborious process. So, as I mentioned, I worked with 10 co-authors, 8 of them finance researchers, geographers, economists, plus a designer and a cartographer, whom I called my dream team, because they were really a dream team. And as I said, for 2 years, we would meet every week. And then I worked another full year, mainly with the designer Oliver Uberti, to edit and finalize the whole thing. We also, just to give you an idea of how time-consuming an atlas is, we also had 200 interns. So they were all Oxford University students who worked on the atlas ideas for a week at a time, mainly collecting data. I estimated that in total, the atlas took between 12 and 15,000 hours of work. So with 80 maps and visuals in the core of the atlas, this gives about, on average, 150 hours per visual, per map. So to give you a breakdown, about 40 hours would be spent on data searching and collecting, 40 hours on data cleaning and geocoding, so making sure we know geographically where this data, what places belong to. Another 40 hours would be studying academic and other literature on the topic to get the angle and all the information right. Then 30 hours we would spend designing the visual, drafting, and editing the text. So there are many complexities involved. As you mentioned, I can give you a couple of examples.
Please.
They exactly concern this topic data angle form process. So, for example, historical data can be very tricky to collect. We have a map in the atlas which shows how in some countries there was a major shift from one leading financial center to another, and the shift took place during the 20th century. So this is the story of Canada, where Montreal used to be the biggest financial center, and then Toronto took the lead. In South Africa, it was Cape Town, and then Johannesburg took the lead. In Brazil, the shift was from Rio de Janeiro to Sao Paulo. In Australia, from Melbourne to Sydney. And there are other examples, like India, from Kolkata to Mumbai. So what we wanted to do was to illustrate this shift with data, but this required data going back to 19th century, data on the number of banks, the origins of these banks operating in each of these cities, population of these cities, and the size of the economy. So this is when we really needed weeks of work by our interns to collect historical data from censuses. Sometimes estimates were needed. For example, we wanted to show how long it took to travel from each of these cities to London as the global financial center in late 19th century. So this then requires insight into historical train timetables, shipping lines timetables. I spent myself several weeks in an Oxford library looking at banks, almanacs, and gazetteers and newspapers, basically collecting information on financial institutions operating in each of these cities. So this is one type of challenge, which is historical data. But it's really, for a good map and story, I think historical data is crucial, because we are not trying to be journalistic, collecting just stories on topical things in the press now, to offer readers something that transcends topics of interest today and gives them some depth and insight of information. We want to go back to history. Another example is very different. So it's on infrastructure monopoly. We have this visual called infrastructure monopoly, and the topic we wanted to present was how infrastructure, so water companies, electricity utility companies, roads, electricity grids, how they became privatized and financialized and treated increasingly with time as financial assets rather than basic infrastructure that should be provided by a country to its citizens. So this is the story we wanted. Then the question was, what kind of data we collect for this topic. So first we were collecting macroeconomic data on the amount of investment and the value of privatizations by year, by country. But then we realized that's not the point. It's much better to tell this story with cases, with examples. So we started to collect data on examples of privatizations, like Thames Water or Texas Central Railway or Amtrak in the US and other companies around the world. And then this led us to challenges because it's difficult to get comparable values. Some of these transactions are not public, so data is proprietary. Journalists could just guess what the value of these transactions was when a public company is sold to private companies, for example. So this was the challenge with data collection. Then once we solved that challenge, there was another challenge, was what kind of angle, what kind of story do we want to tell? Okay, we know a lot of companies operating in infrastructure have been privatized, but many people know it. So what's the story here? And then we decided, well, the story we want to show is that these privatizations and these financializations of infrastructure companies are a bit of a gamble, or even more than a bit. Sometimes they go well and lead to better services, cheaper services. On many occasions, they go wrong. Services are supposed to be cheaper and more efficient. There is supposed to be more investment, which taxpayers don't have to pay for. But then we know, for example, in the UK, what happened with some water companies discharging sewage into rivers. We know what can happen to privatized rail track and railways that suddenly become very expensive and don't operate well at all, and don't operate better than state-owned, publicly owned railways in other countries. So this was the angle, the story we found. And then the final building block after the topic, the data, the story is the form. How do we show this gambling with privatizations and with infrastructures? And then we decided, well, we all played this Monopoly board game. So we decided that we could use the visual metaphor of the Monopoly game to show different types of infrastructures from around the world around the board. We could show how the dice are thrown and what kind of risks and opportunities these transactions represent. A bit like investing in property in the Monopoly game.
Those are such good examples to showcase, as you said, the massive amount of work that goes into this and the complexity of it. Because listeners, just to clarify, each of those examples ends up being one double-page spread in the book. One page. There are so many different visualizations in this book, and that's the amount of work that goes into each and every single one of them. So it really is quite a lot going on. I wonder if you can kind of tell us about a few of the examples now in more detail, now that we have that overview. Obviously, given the range of topics covered in the book, we're not going to be able to talk about every single one of them. But I did pick out some examples that I suppose, dictatorially, as the interviewer, decided I wanted to ask you most about. So first off, can you maybe walk us through the stats that you and your team found around the financial science and research production process?
Thank you, Miranda. I think your choice represents a very enlightened kind of dictatorship, interviewer's dictatorship, because this spread, as you said, that's how it's called in technical language in an atlas. This spread is very close to my skin and the skin of my team because we are researchers, financial researchers, and this visual tells the story of financial research of any kind. And we call it financial science production ladder. It's a ladder because It starts with humble production of financial knowledge in the form of papers, publications, and then it shows how it grows with difficulty and what's interesting about it. So how does any research work? Well, we know the mantra in research, universities and beyond. You publish or perish. So then if you publish well, you get cited by your peers. If you a very experienced, good author, you may get invited to join an editorial board, become a journal editor, and then you oversee the financial science or any scientific production. And then obviously you can get all kinds of prizes for your research and your contributions, with the top of the ladder being the Nobel Prize. Now, how does it work in financial research with data? So when we look at papers, publications, people with US affiliations working in the United States produce by far most papers on finance in the world. But we also show that just over the last 10 years, Chinese researchers have really done a lot to catch up. They're almost catching up in terms of the number of papers they're publishing. So countries like UK is in the third position there in terms of the number of publications. But then when we look at impact of these papers and at the 100 most cited papers on finance ever published, we see a much more concentrated geography. So 85% of these most cited papers on finance were written by US authors. And mind you, only 5% of the total were written by with the participation of any female authors. So we get a very US and male-dominated picture already. And then when we move to the next step of the ladder, when we look at the editors of the top 10 journals in finance, again, 85% of them work in the US, and there are just a couple of women among them. So this US male bias is still very much there. And finally, when we look at Nobel Memorial Prizes in Economic Sciences, and we select 19 winners who got the prize for contributions to understanding finance, contributions to financial economics, we see that, and we were shocked actually when we did this research ourselves, all 19 are or were white males who got their PhDs in the US and worked in the US at the time of the award. So it's extremely little diversity there, which, there is little diversity at the bottom of the ladder. Then by the time we get to the top of it, there is no diversity in terms of countries or in terms of gender. So basically, in this visual, we show that finance is probably the most US and the most male-dominated branch of knowledge. And now you could ask, is this a problem? Why is this a problem? Well, it is a problem because lack of diversity of thinkers leads to lesser diversity of their thinking, right? If there were more women, maybe we would have more financial research and financial innovation focused on everyday household finance rather than on flashy financial instruments, on which you can make $1 billion a week or lose $1 billion a week. Maybe if we had less US focused financial research, because also US financial research is mostly focused on the US alone, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. But if we had more geographically diverse financial research, also at the top of the ladder, maybe we would have more focus on collaboration, international collaboration in finance, more focus on the needs of poorer developing countries. As an example, consider that in microfinance, so small loans, small insurance, in microfinance, we find a lot of women in this activity. In India, for example, we illustrate microfinance in India in the Atlas. We show that actually it's a landscape dominated by financial innovation by women and for women. But then microfinance doesn't really feature as important, particularly at the top of the financial scientific ladder.
Yeah, I mean, of all of that, unfortunately, is not a huge shock from the outside, from not being a finance expert, but even just the detail of people winning the prizes from not just getting their degrees within the US, but working in the US when they get the prizes. I mean, the detail of this and all the pieces coming together really paints quite a clear picture. And again, that's only one page of this atlas. So although I could ask you so many more questions on that particular point, I will move to a different page to continue to give listeners an idea of the breadth of this project. The next thing I'd love to ask you about is kind of very much in this geographical aspect, I suppose. Thinking about the research you and your team have done around the idea of financial crises being something that are seen all over the world in lots of different regions, but interestingly differ in type to a noticeable degree between different regions. The financial crises might happen in this place in a different way that they happen in this other place. What are some of the key differences that we should understand in crises type between different regions?
So in the Atlas, we map all significant financial crises since 1600. So since the start of the 17th century. And that was a useful starting point because right there in the 17th century, we have one of the most infamous financial crises, which was the tulip mania in the Netherlands. So at some point in the 17th century, people were so obsessed and excited about investing in tulips and tulip bulbs that the most expensive tulip bulb in the period actually cost as much as a house in central Amsterdam, a whole house in central Amsterdam. So we wanted to cover that part of history as well. So altogether, in over 400 years that we cover, we have about 1,000 significant financial crises all over the world. And now, as for types, there are three basic types of financial crises. There are banking crises, currency crises, and debt crises. So there are runs on banks when depositors sense that banks are in trouble. There are runs on currency when currency traders sense that the currency of a country, its economy, is in trouble. And there are debt crises which represent defaults of big borrowers. These could be governments, national governments, big corporations, or groups of companies. But obviously, at the end of the day, all financial crises, despite their differences, are about organizations, people borrowing more than they can handle. So borrowing unsustainably. We see that all three types of financial crises increase with time. So since 1600 until now, we see a clear trend, despite all the pronunciations of people, financial research or regulators mastering financial stability. No, we see increasing frequency of financial crises. And this makes sense because the economy grows bigger. it becomes more complex and more interconnected. So it's more likely that a crisis from one place will infect another place and become more significant. So when we mapped all these crises, which strangely had not been done before, even though good quality data sets on the topic became available recently, nobody tried to map it. And when we mapped it, we got some expected results and some surprising results, but overall a fascinating geography of financial crises. So one thing is that when we look at historical financial crises, and because the frequency of the crises has grown, about half of the financial crises in history happened before 1950, and as much as half since 1950, since the middle of the 20th century, because we've had so many over the last 70 years. So what we see on the map that historically, before 1950, Europe was the epicenter of financial instability. And that's because Europe was also the center of economic growth. So this is where the bubbles were growing and bursting like that in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Also, America then became a major center of financial instability, with the example of the Great Crash of the 1929. But then we see that with time, crises move to emerging and developing economies, like Latin America, infamous for its financial instability and the frequency of crises. We also did qualitative research for the Atlas. So in this case, when we were interviewing people in Latin America, in Brazil, Argentina, what struck me personally is that in Argentina, it was almost impossible to talk to finance professionals about finance without them mentioning the word crisis within the first 3 minutes of the conversation. This does not happen in the US, doesn't happen in Asia or in Europe. So we also see on the map that historically, but also in recent decades, Asia has been relatively stable, with a surprisingly low number of financial crises. But the most surprising pattern we saw on the map was how many financial crises have struck African countries since the 1950s, since decolonization and the independence movements that created new African countries, but also recently. Financial crises happened a lot. We don't read and hear about them so much in Europe or in America because they typically contained within Africa. These economies are mostly not so big yet and not so connected with the rest of the world to cause contagion, to cause crises and ripple effects in the rest of the world. But Africa is definitely a continent which has become a center of financial instability. So maps have always been used to see patterns you couldn't see without maps. And this pattern was what we saw about financial instability in the world and its history.
Yeah, this was a really interesting visualization. As you said, it's so hard to see without a map, especially over such a period of history. So useful to have it now in this format. I wonder if we can speak a bit more about something that has come up in a bunch of answers so far, right? I've mentioned cities, you've mentioned cities. And of course, when we're talking about international finance today and the history of international finance over, for example, as you've just given us the long, multiple centuries that some of these visualizations cover, there are some cities that keep coming up. There are some ones that are really big players from a large chunk of time, even as so many other things about politics and economics and social behavior change. So how does that happen? how do cities become international financial centers? And is international finance kind of only dominated by those places, or can there be places that are not maybe front of mind when we think about kind of the spaces that make a difference that can still have an influence on global finance?
International financial centers are one of my favorite topics in research, have been for a long time, partly because they've been studied quite well in history. And to me, they really epitomize why geography matters to finance. So just as the Middle Ages could have Gothic cathedrals, or the ancient civilizations like Egypt had pyramids, I think the late 20th century, early 21st will be associated with the skyscraper landscapes of global financial centers like New York and London, and we know these landscapes keep growing. Also in China, all over the world, and this is what we typically the kind of picture we associate with international financial centers. So what are they? They are hubs of firms that conduct international financial deals. And they're not just financial firms. So the important thing to remember, which we illustrate in the Atlas, is that finance depends on law. Finance depends on accounting and all kinds of business consulting. So all these services are an integral part of financial centers, also international financial centers. So to become such hubs, cities need to offer good conditions for these firms. What are these conditions? They have to offer talent, a lot of top quality labor, not just hundreds of thousands, but tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of skilled professionals. This is the kind of financial services employment that we have in London or New York, counted in hundreds of thousands of people. So typically the big cities have the best chance to become international financial centers. These cities also need to offer infrastructure, both transport, conventional infrastructure like connections with the world through big airports. I couldn't tell you how important it is for international financial centers and their success to have the international airport as close as possible to the financial districts, because the ability for financiers, professionals to actually fly out and back in on the same day and do some deals somewhere far away is extremely important. So when, for example, in Tokyo, they were moving the big international airport away from the city center, the financial sector was rebelling against it, because suddenly they would have to commute not half an hour, but 2 hours to the airport. And this would kind of kill a lot of business for them. So then what happened was the financial sector lobby made sure that the most central airport would still service flights to other financial centers in Asia. So we have stories like this that we mentioned in the Atlas as well. But what else do these cities need? They also need political conditions, like stable political environments. So finance doesn't like cities where politics is very unstable, because they like predictability. A lot of finance is about not just low taxes and flexible or lenient regulation. Predictability is much more important, but they are about predicting the future, investments into the future, sometimes decades into the future. So for that reason, you want predictability and stability of the place you work from, but also, of course, low taxation helps financial and related services as well. But this is the supply side, and there is the demand side. So financial centers thrive in cities where there is a lot of demand for international financial services. So it helps if these cities are hubs of international industry in non-financial companies. and international commerce with headquarters of firms. And sometimes it's an accident which city becomes a financial center. So for example, in Germany, after Berlin was divided after the Second World War and could no longer be an international financial center, Frankfurt became the international financial center. And it features in many places in the atlas. But why Frankfurt? Hamburg was a bigger city, Munich was a bigger city, Cologne was also an attractive city, and so on and so forth. There were many potential candidates in Germany. So why Frankfurt was chosen or evolved as the financial center, international financial center of Germany? Well, actually, the main reason was that Frankfurt was the headquarters of the occupational zone controlled by the United States in Germany after the Second World War, and Frankfurt was the headquarters of the U.S. military in post-war Germany. And for that reason, banks looking for new headquarter locations, new locations, international banks, but also German banks, decided that it will be safer to be in a place which is most likely to be stable and also successful because of the location of the headquarters of the U.S. Army in Germany. So then the German central bank established itself in Frankfurt as well, and then other banks followed, and the rest is history. But of course, other places which are not international financial centers are equally important to international finance. Because finance is all about connections between different places making these connections. For example, places where investors are and intermediaries and advisors to these investors are, like global financial centers, but then places where investment happens, where the money is invested and does its work for better or worse. So to give you an example, if you look at the United States, and in the Atlas, we talk about what happened in the US finance in early 2000s. There was a huge real estate boom with a lot of investment going particularly into states like Florida and Nevada. Also states with relatively low taxes, sunny places with a lot of space for real estate development. So these states saw the biggest boom in house prices in the late 90s and early 2000s in the US. But then a lot of these loans to mortgage borrowers in Florida and Nevada in particular turned out to be unsustainable. They were not being serviced and paid off anymore. And it was real estate in places like Nevada and Florida that led ultimately to the global financial crisis of 2008. Of course, part of the reason was that financial intermediaries in places like New York were using very sophisticated and dangerous financial instruments to invest in Florida, Nevada, and elsewhere. So they were using these mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, financial instruments that were very, very complex, and instruments that were hiding some of the risks involved in such investments. So this gives you an example of how connections between places can lead to financial crisis. We see similar things happening now in China. China is witnessing a real estate crisis, which is not dissimilar to what happened in the US. And again, you have financial intermediaries in places like Shanghai that invested a lot all over China in an unsustainable manner in real estate. Obviously, political capitals, hubs of government also influence global finance a lot through regulation and governance. So places like Brussels, Washington, D.C. So in D.C., as we show in the Atlas, almost next to each other, you have the two most powerful international financial organizations, the World Bank and the International monetary fund, which also is kind of problematic because it obviously reflects the fact that the US could design the international financial order after the Second World War, but I think leads to more limited silo thinking in finance, because basically we have similar people working and living next door to each other who spread the financial ideas all over the world. And probably more collaboration between financial centers and more dialogue and exchange of ideas would be better for global financial stability and reform.
And yet very interesting to map this out and see kind of where we're at now and how we got there. Maybe to make some of those changes in future, we can only hope, but understanding kind of where we're at and why is obviously a key part of that. And it's not just in terms of the different spaces, the different financial centers that are so dominant. You also talk about some other kind of aspects of our current system that perhaps are more one-sided than we might realize. And so I wonder if we can talk about English common law and why this is still such a dominant part of the legal apparatus around finance.
English common law is absolutely important. As someone said, finance is made in law. Without law, there would be no finance. As we illustrate in the Atlas, even the very origins of finance are the same as the origins of law. So the oldest financial instruments that we know of were clay tablets created over 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, which recorded financial contracts that were legal contracts at the same time, and they concerned the delivery of barley to produce beer over long periods of time, with payments in gold for this beer and so on and so forth. But getting back to English common law. So English common law is based on real world cases that come from everyday business practices, like financial transactions. And they are designed, these practices, financial practices, and they are evaluated by and judged by lawyers who establish precedents in the process. And these precedents are then followed, taken into consideration as lawyers in the future evaluate cases. As such, English common law is more flexible than civil coded law in countries like France or Germany or China. Because civil coded law typically lists things that transacting parties in finance are allowed or not allowed to do. So as a result, civil coded law can be much more rigid, with less power and less room for interpretation left to lawyers and judges. There are pros and cons of both systems in general, but finance likes the flexibility of English common law. And in addition, English common law is full of cases concerning international financial deals because international finance proliferated particularly since the rise of the British Empire and more recently. So with the US as the leading financial power globally. Because international finance developed on an unprecedented scale in the second half of the 19th century and ever since. And obviously, US common law is very similar to English common law, though if we look at the map, we have to remember actually not the whole of the United States applies the English common law or the US common law, because Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, which used to be a French colony, follows a combination of French and Spanish civil coded law, at least in private finance, in private law, including finance. So, as a result of these features of both systems, English common law, civil coded law, because of the history of the English common law dominates in finance because many financially influential countries, so UK, US, former British colonies, also tax havens, offshore jurisdictions like British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, they use English common law, but also the international law firms use it. And that's what we show in the Atlas. If you look at the top 10 international law firms in the world that do corporate law, that do finance, all 10 of them, every single one, has headquarters in the US, or in the UK, or in both countries, with London and New York, Chicago and Washington, D.C. In the lead. So whenever big companies or governments around the world need big international transactions, they mostly hire Anglo-American law firms to help them. So this is the result of the dominance of the English common law. Also, English common law is used in international arbitration. If there are any very complex cases, disputes, financial disputes between firms or governments, London is the main place where such disputes are arbitrated by specialist lawyers. Another place, but much less significant, is New York. Another place is Singapore, where I am, which is trying to develop this kind of expertise. But you see, all of these places, including Singapore, use the English common law. So law seems to be, it is a central part of finance, and seems to be the part of finance which has a huge inertia, changes very, very slowly, and has a huge bearing on international finance. So just to finish with the statistics, we estimate that over 90% of international financial transactions, particularly complex transactions like derivatives trading, are subject to contracts written according to the English common law. And if anything goes wrong, these disputes are resolved in London, New York, in few cases in other places. So this is a really powerful influence of history on global finance.
Yeah, hugely powerful influence. That doesn't necessarily get the recognition that it needs. And again, helpful to highlight that here. But the book doesn't just bring the past into our understanding of the present. It also, that is, of course, what I've been asking you about, given my own background as a historian. The book also helps us, though, understand and look at the future as well. So I'd love to ask you about one of the pieces of that from the book, specifically the ways in which you and your team see finance potentially helping with wicked problems like climate change.
Absolutely. We think that finance can help with wicked problems like climate change. It can play a big part in the solution to this problem, but we have to be careful because it can aggravate such problems as well. So let me give you examples of both. How finance can help. One obvious example, but crucial, is that we need more climate finance, more investment from rich countries to developing countries to help their transition to net zero carbon emissions. So commitments have been made in Paris in 2015 and since, but these promises have not been met. And it seems to be extremely difficult for rich countries like the US or the groups like the EU to actually fork out investments to help developing countries to develop, to clean the energy sector, to basically meet their commitments, but without giving up on their economic growth at the same time. Yeah, there are ways to do it, but it requires a lot of investment. And it's really frustrating because, when there was a regional bank a couple of years ago in the US, Silicon Valley Bank, that lost solvency. And then the US government quickly forked out tens of billions of US dollars to resolve the issue. So, helping a bank that got into trouble through reckless operations and investments, a regional bank, a small bank by US standards, was not a problem. But globally, to spend $100 billion to help developing countries with the most important challenge of this century, or maybe ever, suddenly is a problem. Yeah, it could cause inflation. It cannot be approved democratically. We have no legitimacy to do it. There are pains and aches and all kinds of excuses not to spend this money. So this is quite ironic and frustrating. So this is one way that we need new financial institutions and financial mechanisms to finance climate and transition to net zero. Another example, how finance can help, is the combination of finance with new technologies. So some solutions can come from fintech, though surprisingly frustratingly few have so far. But there is one positive example. We have in the Atlas the story of Alipay and Forest. So Alipay is a payment app developed as part of the Alibaba Group, the big tech company in China. Alipay is used for over 1 billion people, but mainly in China, but in other parts of Asia as well. And as a payment app on a smartphone, it knows a lot about what its users do, what they pay for, how they spend money, their insurance, but also how they travel, and so on and so forth, how they spend their time. So through the smartphone. So what Alipay and Forest app does, it collects information on your behavior. So you get points for behavior that they consider, the designers of the app, as more environmentally friendly and more sustainable. So they give you points if you cycle or walk instead of taking public transport, and you get no points if you take a taxi or drive in your car. You get points if you buy a more energy efficient dishwasher. You can get points if you buy foodstuffs that require less plastic. And what can you do with these points? Well, with these points, you cannot buy goods, but you can plant a tree or a shrub if you have few points. If you have a lot of points, you can plant an impressive tree. Well, you don't plant it yourself. When you spend these points, the Alipay Ant Foundation plants the trees. Why would they do that, right? What they get in exchange is obviously the attention of the users of the app. In fact, they got a lot of attention because over 100 million people in China used the app, mainly young people in big cities, sitting on the couch or whatever, before going to work, eating breakfast, spending points to plant a tree. Over 300 million trees were planted in the period of just a few years. So this became the biggest afforestation and reforestation action ever witnessed. And most of the trees were planted in northern China in semi-arid areas. So this is an example of how these points, as a kind of new type of money, because we can imagine future money being partly about points we collect for our behavior, how such use of money, almost a new definition of money, can be used to nudge people in new directions. These can be more environmentally responsible directions. Of course, there is no free lunch here, and such solutions can raise alarm. For example, if these apps, if new type of money is based on information about everything we do, this could also be considered as total surveillance, right? It's, do we want money to operate in this way? Many people do. Many people propose such solutions. So there are no easy fixes here. But as I said, there could be a lot of bad things that finance can do in trying to solve these problems as well. So, for example, more investment in some sectors, obviously investment in fossil fuels, in coal mining. This is a way in which finance can contribute to climate change and is still contributing to climate change. Another kind of solution that finance can help with is through taxation, because we have good research which shows that the super rich, the top 0.1% of the richest people on the planet, are responsible for a huge share of carbon emissions, actually, because of their lifestyle. It's not even necessary to tax the wealth highly or the income, but at least the most polluting activities could be taxed more, which is something that most countries still do not do. So there are easier and much more complex solutions that involve technology, but some of them also obviously require political support.
Yeah, no, of course. As you said, there's no free lunch. It's all entangled up together, as we've discussed in history today and obviously in the future as well. I wonder if I could ask you, I suppose, to pick out one to tell us a little bit about. You've given us so many different examples from the book. You've kindly answered my dictatorial decision of which bits of the book to highlight. But I'm wondering if there's one that kind of maybe was your favorite to work on or to see realized, even if it's not necessarily kind of a big showcase one. So many of the pages have multiple different visualizations on them. I'm wondering if there's one in particular that kind of jumped out at you as your favorite or the most surprising when you saw it. Anything like that?
Thank you for asking. I would like to use two examples, but brief. So one concerns history. And I was really thrilled when I realized I was doing research in museums because I wanted to learn more about the history of money. This was happening during the pandemic, so most of the time museums were closed. But at some point, wearing a mask, you could go to a museum, and often there would be few people around you, people keeping distance or not there, being afraid. So I would visit Ashmolean Museum in Oxford a lot, or the British Museum. They have wonderful money collections. And there I also spoke to curators of these exhibitions. And from one of them in Oxford, I found about this fantastic digital humanities project that they had, which was collecting data on Imperial Roman coin hoards. So we're talking about coins, that were hidden underground, that were discovered by archaeologists and others later. As we know, in the UK, there are still, on a weekly basis, people discover Roman coins buried underground. But what we did, so we took these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of data points about coin hoards being found in different parts of the world, because they were found not just within the borders or the limits of the Roman Empire. They were found in today's Sri Lanka, in India, in Northern Europe, where the Roman Empire did not reach. And Roman money was buried underground in these places, mainly because of trade, sometimes because of wars that the empire was fighting with these places, and the money got there in the form of some war tribute or otherwise. But the most interesting thing I saw on this map, which I couldn't explain for a long time, was that there were a lot of coin hoards in different parts of Europe, particularly in the lower Danube region or lower Rhine region, or in Britannia, in Judea and Syria, in the Middle East. But very few very few Roman imperial coin hoards found on the Italian peninsula, close to Rome, particularly close to Rome. And this didn't make sense to me because I thought, well, there was so much wealth and the center of the empire, the financial center of the empire was in Rome. So why do we have so few coin hoards found in the center of the empire? So then I spoke to historians and went to museums again, and I realized that this is a counterintuitive geography because people bury coins or buried coins underground when they had to. And mostly they would obviously use this money, they bury it underground, they would spend it or they would hand it over to future generations. So it was in the unstable parts of the empire, like Judea or like Britannia, where there were a lot of uprisings against the Roman Empire. There was a lot of instability. This is where people had to bury the coins deeply underground, and often they were killed or they had to flee, so they couldn't recover it. And then nobody else knew where it was. Whereby in the center of the empire, close to Rome, people had few reasons to flee, and a few people were killed and forgot about their money buried underground. So this is a counterintuitive pattern that a map like this allows. And I was really happy to see that humanities can be a fantastic source of data, of digital data for financial cartography. Another much shorter example is contemporary. So one of my favorite spreads that surprised me shows the development of central bank digital currencies. So these are digital currencies, but not like Bitcoin. They are created by central banks and the governments, fully digital to digitize transactions, tax payments, and everything. And here we mapped countries according to the stage of the development of CBDC. So there are countries that didn't even start. There are countries piloting these projects. There are countries only researching them. There are countries which already launched them. And we see the pattern is that actually a lot of advanced economies, most technologically savvy economies like the US, are quite behind in these projects, central bank digital currency. And the leading countries are often developing countries like Nigeria. And this, again, surprising counterintuitive geography can be explained because in very technologically advanced countries, there are a lot of big tech companies that don't want the government to lead the development of digital currencies. They want to lead such developments, propose their own currencies, and provide technologies. It is often in countries like Nigeria, where the government wants to take initiative and lead the development. So this is something which I found very interesting and important in the story of finance as well.
Two great examples. Thank you for adding those into our discussion. And I think that gives listeners, I think, a taste of the depth and breadth of the book. Of course, knowing that there's so many other pages and visualizations we didn't quite get to, but lots, therefore, for listeners to explore in presumably reading the books themselves. So, Dariusz, that leaves me with only one final question. This is obviously a huge project, but it is out in the world. People can go get the book. So are there things that you have on your horizon to work on next? Is the next step for you sort of 6 months of sleep to recover? What does your immediate future look like?
I don't want to sleep now because with the Atlas of Finance being out there, it's really the most exciting time of my life now to engage with the audience, talk to you and your audience about what's in the Atlas of Finance and how they could find it interesting. So what I'm working on now, other than talking about the Atlas, builds on this atlas. So I'm working on a series of educational videos because I would really like to promote Atlas of Finance to not only universities but also high schools to produce educational materials. There are so many ways to teach about financial concepts, to improve financial literacy, and help people understand finance, also in high schools, in ways that are attractive, not just with equations, with text, but with visuals that help to understand all these things about investment, about digital money, and so on. And another idea, dream I have, building on the Atlas of Finance, is to develop an online interactive atlas of finance, maybe a section of finance. Maybe it would focus on sustainable finance or finance and sustainability. So this project has been a great learning experience, and I want to learn things by digitizing the atlas, making it interactive, making it move, and helping people understand finance even better, and finance practitioners make better financial decisions.
Well, that sounds like a very cool kind of outgrowth of this project. So best of luck with that transformation of the information. And of course, as we've both mentioned, listeners can go read the book, again, titled Atlas of Finance, Mapping the Global Story of Money, published by the Yale University Press in 2024. Dariusz, thank you so much for being with me on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure, Miranda. Thank you.